It gives me great pleasure to welcome Tim Whitford as our guest speaker this evening. I've not had the pleasure of meeting Tim before today. I did see his engaging presentation at the Croydon Military Group, which he gave about 3 or 4 months ago, I can't remember, and thought at the time he'd be a great speaker for one of our meetings. And so I threw my hat in the ring, and sure enough he decided to come. Tim's a South Gippslander who spent 15 years in the Royal Australian Armoured Corps in cavalry and heavy armour. That means tanks and stuff like that. And he served overseas with the British Army in Germany and Cyprus. After leaving the ADF, he worked at the Shrine of Remembrance, and Ken certainly knows it popular from there, as an education officer and outreach officer, where he travelled all over Victoria telling the stories of our veterans to students. And in 2014, he took up a position with the RSL Victoria as a professional veterans advocate for 7 years. In the background, he's pursued a lifelong passion for the study of the Great War. He was part of the team that researched and advocated for the missing of Fromelles, the soldiers that were reinterred after their grave was eventually discovered, which led to the discovery and recovery, of 250 previously missing Australians killed in battle in 1916. He was one of only 3 Australians awarded the Médaille de Commune de Fromelles, that's the best I can do for French, by the French for his role in that. He's also led about a dozen tour groups of Australian pilgrims to the old Western Front battlefields and the World War II sites of France, Belgium and Germany. Tonight, it's about Victoria. Please provide a warm welcome to Tim Whitford to speak about the enemy POWs and internees in Victoria during World War II.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
It's kind of a weird privilege for me to be invited into this, I don't know what you call yourself, a pod or a nest of naval people. I feel crew, kind of a crew. I got interested into the POW experience in Victoria as a result of going through my own great-grandfather's Second World War file. Now, my own great-grandfather, Tom, he was a First World War man. He'd been wounded and got what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder on the Somme. He was buried alive by shell fire, and that was the end of his First World War. And my dad remembered him as an old man, physically shaking in his lounge chair at night. But when I went through his military files, I found the old bugger, when the Japanese entered the war in the Second World War, he signed up for a second go, which I take my hat off to that generation. And so he didn't find himself fighting Japanese up in the Pacific. They sent him to Murchison to guard prisoners of war, and that was his second war. And I just needed to know more, and I find it an absolutely fascinating subject. It's a story of humanity when we didn't have to show humanity. So I hope that sort of unfolds as we go. It's pretty much a story of the Golden Valley, because that's where most of the camps were set during the Second World War. But it really starts in the United Kingdom. Our Victorian POW and internment story starts in the United Kingdom. Come the start of the Second World War, 1939, the British government found itself with thousands and thousands of what they called then enemy aliens within their borders. And they were pretty much unprepared for the security risk that they represented. And so, Prime Minister Churchill, when he came into power, sort of said, who do we lock up? Who do we not lock up? Who's a risk? Who's not a risk? And he couldn't really get a straight answer. And so in the end, he made his executive decision, and it was collar the lot. And he famously said that. So what then happened was the British started locking up their enemy aliens on the Isle of Wight, for example, and up in the cold areas of Scotland. They created, camps, but it was always just a temporary solution. They reached out to the governments of Australia and Canada, can you help us? And we'll give you some money if you provide us a home for our enemy aliens and any prisoners of war. The British had captured some German vessels on the high seas, etc., at this early stage of the war, and they wanted to house them. And Australia said, yep, we'll do it. And so, very quickly, a scheme was devised where enemy aliens and prisoners of war would be shipped via India, usually, and they would find themselves in Australia and Canada. We also had our own problems. Now, this is a photo I got from the Australian National Archives, and it was taken in 1938, and it's a photo of the Tanunda, Barossa Valley branch of the Australian Nazi Party. And so we had our own German, Italian, enemy diaspora in this country. And you can see these guys were obviously not arch criminals because they had their photo taken in 1938. And these guys would have been quickly nabbed by the federal police, basically the precursors of the federal police. And they would have found themselves behind barbed wire in the camp complex in the Goulburn Valley and in South Australia. Love Day in South Australia. So, let's add another layer. In 1940, the Australian Imperial Force was over in the Middle East. And under that magnificent British General O'Connor, our Australian Army, Navy and Air Force are in combat against the Italian forces early, later on the German forces, and also the Vichy French forces. And particularly the Italians. Australians found themselves owning hundreds and hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners of war. And so, I don't know if any of you have seen it, a lone digger with a greatcoat herding thousands of Italian prisoners of war into captivity, captured at places like Bardia and the assault on Tobruk.
Well, we're glad to be prisoners.
Some were, some fought very hard, and so we had this mixed bag of Italian hardcore fascists and Italian conscripts that, as you said, were not very keen to fight. Many of them end up via India into Australia, into the camp complex. Now, I keep saying about the Goulburn Valley. Why the hell would we put people in our Goulburn Valley? Well, there's a number of reasons. Port of Melbourne is close enough that you can bring shiploads of these people. There are rail links from the Port of Sydney via, you have to change trains at Albury back then. And they were looking for a place where there was permanent water, enough to keep thousands of people, but far enough away from the capital cities, whereas if there was a mass breakout, it could be contained. And there were big army bases between the prisoner of war camp complexes and the ports where they might want to break out to. So places like Puckapunyal and Seymour Camp. And so there are a number of camps set up, and here's some examples. Camp 2 and 4 were internment camps. Camp 2 was for Asiatic civilians. Camp 4 was a family camp where German and Italian families, enemy alien families, would have been put in. Camp 1 was for German and Italian enemy single men, and that was known broadly through the ADF, through the Australian defence circles, as the Nazi camp for internees. Also, Camp 13 was a proper prisoner of war camp for soldiers and non-commissioned officers. And you can see Durangile there was a camp for German officers. So they kept the officers and the men separately. Italian prisoners of war officers were kept in a camp in Myrtleford in Victoria. So, that's basically why they find themselves in the Goulburn Valley. You can see the Waranga Basin there, permanent water, irrigation systems. They hoped to put the soldier and NCO prisoners to work for the Australian war effort. You'll see that unfold later. Now, some of the first prisoners or internees that arrive in Australia arrive on the ship, the Dunera, which arrives in Sydney Harbour. The guard force was British Army, conscript British Army, and when they arrive at Sydney Harbour, the Dunera unloads and then they're handed over into the custody of the Australian Army. And immediately when they get off that ship, the Australian Army starts sending reports back to the UK that there's something not right about these internees that you've sent us from on the Dunera. We think they're not Nazis, because most of them were Jews. They were German and Austrian Jews, and they were the most opposite of Nazis that you could imagine. But they had had a hell of a journey. Their baggage had been robbed, thrown overboard. They'd been very poorly treated by the British garrison. Many of them were assaulted. And when they got off the Dunera and handed over into the custody of these Australian, many First World War veterans, they were very, very glad to come under our supervision. And so cables start going backwards and forwards between Britain and Australia, saying, "What? Are you serious? What do you want us to do with these Jewish Australians? Jewish Germans that have arrived on the Dunera?" In the meantime, they've had to be contained, and so they were put into a camp not far from between Tatura and Murchison, Camp Number 2, and that was even now is known as the Dunera Camp. All right. Some of them were put into a camp at Hay, but that was found to be completely unsuitable. It was hot, flies. It was not suitable for camp, and eventually they all end up in Camp Number 2 near Murchison. They start interacting with the Australian Guard Force. Many of these First World War men, and they were treated very fairly. But almost immediately, the Guard Force start making complaints, and not against the prisoners, not against the internees, but against the military system. One set of complaints I found in the National Archives I thought was really funny. They said, "The prisoners are getting better rations than us. Why are we getting this slop and these people are getting this great food?" And so, the people in Victoria Barracks in Melbourne sent some officers down to do an investigation. And they go into the admin building there at Camp Number 2, and they bring in, Sergeant Smith, the army cook there at Camp Number 2, and he said, "Yeah, it's ridiculous. We get this slop. The prisoners, they're eating the best quality food. Oh, we better bring the headman from the camp in, the German headman." And he comes in, he says, "Before you even start talking, I'd like you to introduce you to our 2 head cooks from our prisoner of war cohort." And here's, Jaime and Helmut. Jaime was the head chef in the Berlin Adlon Hotel before he escaped. And here's a helmet from the London Dorchester. And so they were getting the same rations, the same mutton, the same flour, the same, it's just what you do with it. An army cook is, they've all eaten some slop. But they were able to do some pretty special stuff. And in the end, the guard force was often found sneaking in to try and eat with the denier. And after about 1943, they started, the British said, you do what you want with them. We don't want them back, but you do what you want with them. And so the federal government vetted them, and almost all of them were given the option of freedom. Many of them wanted to join the war effort. And so, although they weren't allowed to join the Australian Army as combat troops, they joined, as construction and forestry troops. And many of them served from 1943 until demobilisation, doing their bit for the Australian Army. The Denier boys were a very tight-knit group. They'd been through hell to get here, and then they'd gone through this process where they all lived together, and these were some of the finest people in Europe. I've talked about some of the chefs that were in the camp, but on that Denier came some of Europe's finest scientists, medical minds, lawyers, musicians, and many of them opted to stay after the war. And they used to come back to their old camp every couple of years and have a reunion. And the Denier boys, you can see how tight they are and how happy they are to be with each other as late as 1990. Okay, so the family camps. Camp 3 and 4, and you can see Asian civilians here in this family camp. The European civilians had a similar experience. I knew one Jewish lady, her name was Goldie, and her father was an artist, quite a famous artist. And this lady said, I remember my time in the camps in the Second World War as one of the greatest times in my life, because I had my family with me. Dad didn't have to go out to work. My mum was with me. We were all together for 3 or 4 years. We were together, and she remembers those camps very fondly. The CEO of Camp 4, the European family camp, was a fellow called Ruffton, and he won the Victoria Cross during the First World War. And he used to leave the gate open so the kids could come and go. And when an inspector from the ADF came along, they had a go at him and said, why do you leave the gate open and let these enemy alien kids come and go? And he said, we're Australians, we don't make war on children. And that was basically, I remember reading that and I think, that's the way you run a prisoner of war and internment setup. Now, let's move on to internment camp number 1. Now remember I said this is for single German and Italian internees. Many of them gathered up from Australia, many of them from the UK, many of them very politically fascist in mind. And so it was known as the Nazi camp. Basically behind the barbed wire, they elected their own people to run the camp. So everyone had a job. In internment camp number 1, they had their own kitchens, they had their own stores, they had their own entertainment facilities which we'll go into, and the Australians basically maintained security outside the wire, but internal running of the camp was left to these people. And very quickly they worked out the hierarchy. People that were left-wing or Jewish, they were quickly hustled out and taken into the Denier camp because this was very much a fascist camp. It was run according to the Geneva Convention. So, in theory, there were many escapes, many assaults. There was a fair bit of violence. There were people. There was one fella called Håkan Nilsson, not German, Norwegian, and he railed against his captivity during the whole war. He was a radio operator on a Norwegian freighter who'd been caught off Sydney Harbour, and they chucked him in internment camp number 1 because, Norwegians kind of like German, right? And he railed against his captivity and said, I'm bloody Norwegian, I'm on your side, you idiots. And they said, shut up, you're staying in here. Didn't speak a word of German when he got put in there, but after a while the Germans sort of said, hey, they're treating you pretty badly, we hear you're a guru on radios. He goes, yeah, sure, I'll build you a radio. And he built him a radio. They dug a cellar, an underground cellar for him, and he would, they had a secret antenna. In fact, it was the whole roof of one of those tin P1 huts, and they'd lifted up the tin. The Germans would complain to the Australian authorities that the roof was leaking, and the Australians would, we'll fix it, we don't care, And so they lifted up the tin and they put rubber insulators. And it just happened that roof was pointing towards Berlin, and they would tune into Berliner Rundfunk. And every night he would go down into his cellar with some paper and a pen, and he would listen to his secret radio, and he would get the news from the other side of the world, the German news. And the Australian authorities never knew the whole time that there was this radio. Well, they did find out in the end, but for ages, German internees would come up to the guards and say, "Oh, you blokes, you're trapped in Tobruk. You're not doing too well over there, right?" And the Australians are going, "How the hell do they know this?" Well, they had this radio the whole time. Håkan Nilsson was down in his cellar every night transcribing Berliner Rundfunk, and they had the BBC and Berliner Rundfunk long before the Australian Guard Force ever knew what was going on. There were many escapes. Håkan Nilsson was caught twice crossing the line. They even had the phones tapped in Camp 1. There was always some German with a toothache lying on the ground going, oh, but really he had an earpiece in his ear, and they tapped into the telephone wire which cut through the corner of the camp. They had this joint pretty well sorted. So the Australians, the most they could do under the Geneva Convention was you could get 28 days solitary confinement. And so these cells that are still standing there in the what was the site of Camp 1, these were full all the time. And there's graffiti still on the wall inside. And one of them says, I'm not a fascist. You treat me like an animal, I am not an animal. I remember reading that in the original Italian, thinking, wow, these guys, there's something about having your liberty deprived from you, right? So 28 days was the most you could get in these solitary confinements. It's interesting also, graffiti on that wall. I found VX 121212, Private Smith, 14 days for drunk. So they were using these same cells for the guard force, because remember they're in the middle of the Goulburn Valley with nothing to do, no local league, no nothing. And so these guys were, it was bored on both sides of the wire. Another form of punishment. Now this is in Camp 1. It's not something that, we're proud of, I guess. Anyone know what this might be? No? I took a school group out there once, and they said, oh, this is where they shoot people against the wall, And no, it's not. It's even worse. They would deny the internees use of their bowling alley that they built. So here's an example of some of the stuff, like these people were ingenious people, right? They had a 2-lane bowling alley, Kegel, the German version of bowling, and they would carve their own balls, and there would be an attendant there, you know, they had a ramp that would return the balls. That was some guy's job. Everyone had a job, you know. And this is the internals of the cafe at the end of the bowling alley. You can see art, original art from artists in the camp, furniture made from just red gum that they've cut down near the Warringah Basin. Some incredibly talented people in these camps. They had their own version of the My Music Bowl there. And that guy there conducting the orchestra, his name's Dr. Gruber. Now, Dr. Gruber was the band leader and conductor of the Vienna Boys Mozart Choir. And they were in the middle, when the war started, of a world tour. And they just happened to be in Perth when war was declared, and the ship was, you know, trying to get out of Perth, and they said, And so they grabbed Dr. Gruber and the Vienna Boys Mozart Choir, and they went in the bag. Now, these are kids, right? And the government said, oh, we're not going to, you know, we don't make war on children. So they let these kids out into the community. But they wanted an organisation that would protect these kids and look after them while they were released into the community. So they were released into the hands of the Catholic Church. So, anyway, Dr. Gruber, he was also vetted and released into the community. No threat whatsoever to Australian society. He was living in Melbourne with his landlady, a woman, and her daughter, and you know, in his file is words to the effect that, you know, he may or may not have been having an affair with his landlady. But then when the landlady discovered that he was also probably having an affair with the landlady's daughter, she immediately denounced him as a Nazi. And he ends up back in the camps. And so he spent his war in Camp 1, released I think in 1947. And you can just see, there's one of the concerts in their little sound shell. And there were musicians there, violinists from Vienna. You know, they had some of the finest classical music ever heard in this country was heard in what is now a paddock in Murchison. Incredible. Another form of punishment that could happen, you can see this is taken from one of the guard towers. You can see the vicar's machine gun watching the camp. Something else they would do was they would deny you use of the tennis courts. You can see there a couple of people playing tennis, and you could go in this camp, you know, when you weren't being punished, you could get tennis lessons. There's actually a tennis practice wall there, and it's still standing today. You could get tennis lessons from the German Davis Cup tennis coach, who was also locked in there. You know, the talent that was kept behind the wire during the war was incredible. So that's Camp 1. By the end of the war, they had planted gardens so immense that you could walk from hut to hut to hut without ever exposing yourself to the harsh Golden Valley sun. Arbours, you know, covered with vines, beautiful flower gardens, ornamental ponds, fountains. In fact, when the army handed this back, this was the first sewered hospital, that next door to it is a hospital that the prisoners used. The first sewered hospital, properly flushed toilets in the Golden Valley. And so they used it as a maternity hospital after the war. Now we go to Camp 13. Camp 13 was a proper prisoner of war camp for military and naval prisoners of war. 4,000 people in here at any given time. And we're talking about a proper prisoner of war camp. We're talking about machine guns, searchlights, night curfews, locked in your hut at night. A huge complex. The top left photo you can see just when they start building it. It's a classic Australian prisoner of war camp, broken into 4 compounds. Can you see that? And you can see at the start of the war they're living in tents. They had to build their own barbed wire fences and wire themselves in. By the end of the war you can see how extensive it is, that top right photo. P1 huts, 4 compounds, search lit at night, all night. One of the few places that the blackout brownout wasn't active in this country. Direct telephone communications to Puckapunyal and Melbourne, and a rail network from Murchison East Station. Proper prisoner of war camp. You can see in between two of the layers of fencing, and there's a third layer. You can see this strip of what we call bastard wire in the army. You know, nevertheless, many escapes. Many escapes. Now, here's one of the points where guards would count people in and out. These men were NCOs, non-commissioned officers and soldiers, and they were allowed to be used for work parties during the day. Now, around these camps, because of the the Waranga Basin and the irrigation network, huge fields of tomatoes and pyrethrum were grown. Pyrethrum to make insecticide to stop, because our guys were now fighting up in the Pacific, and stop the malaria, and tomatoes for, you know, canned tomatoes, yum yum yum, right? And to feed the for our war effort. And you can see the guards here, they're just in their khaki drill with the old First World War light horse bandoliers. They started the war with the current 303 rifle, the same rifle that the rest of the army was using, but by the end of the war they'd taken them off them because the rifles were needed up in the Pacific, and they gave them the 310 Martini Cadet, which was a smaller version of what the British Army fought the Zulus with in the Zulu War. Anyone watch the movie Zulu, you'll see the Martini. So, you know, security was serious. You know, the machine guns never went away, but the equipment and the way these prisoners were handled altered throughout the war. Now, when the Japanese entered the war, it caused a bit of a stink. Oh, sorry, before I move away, you can see some of these prisoners of war, right? Well, what have I done there? There. This guy, can you see him? Africa Korps, captured in the desert, one of Rommel's desert soldiers, right? This guy here is wearing an Australian tunic. It would have been dyed cherry red so that, you know, to tell the difference between an Australian soldier and an escaped prisoner of war. They wore this burgundy cherry coloured uniform when they were outside the wire. I've done that again. He's German Navy, Kriegsmarine, right? Loads and loads of Kriegsmarine were locked up behind the wire. So probably, you know, I was going to say 2/3 Africa Korps, German Army, and 1/3 German Navy. So you can see there's a mixture. There's another naval guy. Can you see that? And they were taken outside the wire on these work parties during the day. Some German prisoners of war there was a sub-camp at Greytown. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Greytown prisoner of war camp. That was a wood cutting camp. They would cut, you know, that valuable ironbark timber for the firewood to keep the homes warm in Melbourne and Sydney. Okay? And I knew one guard that he was in charge of some Germans. They would have to give their parole before they were allocated to Greytown camp. And he said, "Tim, I once got 17 Germans on a Jeep." Now, anyone ever seen a Jeep? 17 Germans. And because, you know, their truck had broken down, and he goes, "Oh, bugger it, get in, I'll take you back." So this Jeep would have come back into camp sitting on its springs, I reckon. But he said they were wonderful people, clean, spotlessly clean. They would work hard and they would compete with each other to cut more timber each day. And he said, after the war, he was, you know, he'd been up to fight the Japanese. He was a bit messed in the head, and his name was Clary McGilvray. And I guess he was the first ever backpacker. So he jumped on a ship and he ended up in Hamburg in Germany and spent some time in Germany just wandering. And one night, you know, Germany had the hell blown down, but one night he'd been in a pub and he was staggering down the street looking for somewhere to stay, and this German policeman tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You will come with me." He said, "Clary McGilvray, you will come with me." And that was one of the German prisoners that he'd actually guarded in Murchison and Greytown. And he came and stayed at this man's house. Isn't that a small? If you treat people like a human being, it can come and pay you back. Now, when the Japanese enter the war, the Germans start preparing for the Japanese to invade Australia. You know, the Japanese were coming south. It didn't look like we were going to stop them. And so the Germans start making armbands with swastikas on them. And they start stashing blankets, money, bits of uniform, so that if the Japanese came south within range of these camps, the plan was they were going to break out and join the Japanese forces and cause havoc behind the Australian lines. They dug a tunnel, an extensively big tunnel. It had electric lights and it was over 120 metres long before it was discovered. When it was discovered, that was interesting because the Americans had arrived in Seymour Camp and from the 41st United States Infantry Division. And this, when the Americans got told, "Oh, we've found a German escape tunnel," their engineers were given the task of come and destroy this tunnel. And this was the Americans' first chance to get to grips with the enemy. And they came down with truckload after truckload after truckload of explosives, and they literally blew it sky high, this tunnel, and to the point where there was dirt raining down almost a kilometre away, and people were running for their lives, literally running for their lives. So the Americans never got a call after that. Now, with all this drama with Germans stashing stuff and making armbands, and just generally they became more belligerent, less obedient to the guard force. One day, they'd do 2 roll calls at least every day, and the roll was being called, and they were just being disobedient, and the camp commandant of Camp 13 said, "We're going to search your huts, and we're going to confiscate any contraband items." And the German head NCO said, "Not without an escort. You guys will just steal off us, blah blah blah." And there was a bit of a ruckus, and somewhere in that ruckus, that argument on a parade, someone yelled out "dismissed" in German. And after that, the whole of the German prisoner of war cohort start running towards their huts, to try and beat the guard force for this search. The guard force wasn't ready for it, and someone panicked. And there ensued 28 seconds of undisciplined fire. Many German prisoners of war were wounded, and one fella, Obergefreiter Tobias Schurtzenthaler, Senior Corporal Tobias Schurtzenthaler, an Afrika Korps man, he was killed. He remains the only German soldier killed by gunfire on Australian soil during the Second World War. And as you can see, he was buried with full military honours in the Murchison Cemetery. And you can see, they're doing that Elon Musk salute over his Now I thought, oh, that's interesting. He's now got his after the war he was moved into the Tachura German War Cemetery. There's a German War Cemetery in Tachura in Victoria. Yeah. Right? All the German war dead from both world wars are now in one cemetery at Tachura. And I thought, I wonder what happened to Tobias Schurtzenthaler's grave. So I went to the same spot quite recently, and his grave, or the spot where his grave is still there, and it's now owned by an Australian veteran who's buried in there. So DVA took control of those graves. They were government-issued graves back then. Schurtzenthaler got exhumed, taken somewhere else, and a DVA veteran, who died in later life, he now occupies that grave, hopefully forevermore. Now you can see here's the funeral party for Tobias Schurtzenthaler. The Australian authorities even allowed a firing party of German soldiers with steel helmets and rifles to fire a volley of blanks over the grave. Took the rifle straight off him afterwards, of course. But you can see in this photo, an Italian, a representative of the Italian forces. We've got an Afrika Korps man. We've got a German sailor, a Kriegsmarine officer. And here we have a sailor who will become more obvious soon. He's the senior German officer in the Australian camp complex throughout the war. And again, just another example of that if you treat people with humanity, it's kind of an example of what the right thing to do. Now, this guy here, he never set foot in Australia during the war. In fact, he was killed during the Easter Battle in Tobruk in 1942. And his name's Oberst Ponath, Colonel Ponath. And he was much loved by his men from the 14th Machine Gun Battalion. Much loved. So many of his battalion were captured during that Easter Battle at the Siege of Tobruk, and they ended up in Camp 13, Murchison, Victoria during the war. Now, they built him a war memorial. And that war memorial, a war memorial to an enemy officer, a Nazi, still sits out in a paddock in Victoria today. Isn't that amazing? Surrounded by cacti from the little garden that they planted around it, and this ornamental pine tree. Yep, you can still see that from the road today. Horses grazing around it. Now, that senior German officer was Captain Detmers from the German auxiliary cruiser, the Kormoran. The Kormoran is famous as being the ship that sunk HMAS Sydney off the West Australian coast. And Detmers and many of his crew ended up in the bag, and they spent the war in the Golden Valley. Now, I remember meeting an officer who was one of the officers of the Guard Force. All the German officers were kept here at Durrangile Mansion during the Second World War. So only German officers in this camp. It's an old 19th century mansion, and up until about a week ago, it was after the war ended, it was handed to the people of Victoria, and then it became Her Majesty's Prison, Durrangile. And so all the German officers right through the war were kept in Durrangile Mansion. It was a German officer's Auflager, an officer's prison during the war. Detmers lived here. They gave him the top room in the tower of the mansion. So you have to go up a little set of steps, and Detmers had his own private room, and below that was the office of his adjutant. And that was the dumbest move ever, I think, from the Australian authorities, is to give him the best room in the house. Detmers knew the Geneva Convention chapter and verse. Now this Australian officer who'd he'd been fighting the Japanese, he got wounded, and so when he came back he was hospitalised. Then his next posting was to guard German officers at Durrangile. His name was Connor, and he told me, he goes, because I asked him if he'd ever met Detmers. He goes, Detmers had to meet him every bloody day. And he said, to me, he was the epitome of a Prussian bastard. He hated him, because he said he was a stickler for the Geneva Convention. And one of the little rules that Detmers would insist on was that because he was higher ranked than just about anyone in the camp, you had to salute him. And Connor told me all he ever got from me was a bit of a wave. He did not like him. Now, Detmers was one of 20 prisoners of war, the biggest German prisoner of war escape during the Second World War from Australian captivity. They dug a tunnel over 120 metres long. It was not shored, through sandy soil. It was a death trap. And 20 German officer prisoners got out and escaped into the heat of the Australian night. And Detmers was at large for over a week. When they caught him, some local VDC guys, some local, like Home Guard, the local farmers who grabbed the rifle and the slouch hat if something happened, they knew the place like the back of their hand, and they saw a little campfire one morning, and they just walked. They rang the cops. They didn't even go up to this guy. The local cop came, left his pistol in the car, and just said to the driver, "If I start running, you start running towards me with the pistol." He walked up to Detmers and his mate, and Detmers he said he looked like hell. He'd been at large for a week without any real tucker, getting eaten alive by mosquitoes, dodging tiger snakes in the irrigation channels. He was ready to hand himself in. He went very quietly, just sat in the back of the car all the way to Shepparton. He was then held in Old Melbourne Jail for a while they worked out what to do with him. What happened? 6 or 7 days in Old Melbourne Jail, and then back to Durham for his 28 days in what they call the dungeon in Durham. The tunnel, they found where the tunnel was and then put dynamite in the ground, in the sandy soil, right around the perimeter, and blew it and collapsed that the sandy soil, made it soft, and no more tunnels for the rest of the war. I was so lucky, about 2 weeks ago, I was able to get in there. It was incredible. It was like time travel. You can see how little it's changed, right? The tunnel actually ran sort of diagonally past that car and out under the front fence. Here's Detmers. That's him there with some of his officers getting his photo taken. And I reckon if I get that, there's that. That's where the photo was taken just there. Can you see that hut in the trees?
Where's that building exactly?
It's on the main road between, if you go to the town of Murchison and you head towards Tatura, it's just 200 metres off the main road. Yeah, you really can't miss it. You can literally see it for miles. And Detmers lived up in the tower. Now, right throughout the war, Detmers kept a diary. He'd been interrogated by Australian naval authorities upon capture, and he actually gave a very accurate description of what happened in the battle between the Sydney and the Kormoran that night. But no one believed him. They thought, it couldn't have been that simple. Sydney couldn't have got that close and been sunk, But his account was actually incredibly accurate. But he kept this diary, all his complaints, everything he did during the war. And the way he did that was he had a Bible, and he would, for each letter that he wanted to write in a word, he would prick a hole in this diary. So throughout the course of this diary, the story of his war would be unfolded, and he obviously didn't want the Australians to find that. So that diary and a secret radio and some other contraband he had in a hide, and it was only discovered. He wrote after the war that he had a hide under the steps just near his room. Now, Her Majesty's prison had never found that hide. I did. Just the other day, I went, me and my mate Paul, we were given free run of this place. There's no prisoners there now. They're about to hand it back to the local community. And Detmer's room has not been touched since the war, trust me. And so I'd heard that he had it under the second step up from his, it's actually under the third step. Because tap, 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 completely different, and it had a false wall. You could just pull it down. Unfortunately, Detmers had taken all his stuff, so. But it was like time travel. Now the dungeons are still there. You know, they're called the dungeon. They were just the solitary confinement cells, but they're down under the mansion. It was purposely designed so that cool air would go down there. You know, like it was called the summer house when it was built. You know, people would go down there in the heat of the summer and stay cool, right? Whereas, you know, when it became a prisoner of war camp, they just put iron gates there, and that became the confinement cells. It was fascinating, and it was nice and cool there. So it would have been actually a pretty good way to spend 28 days compared to that. Up in his room there, it is hot. You know, glass windows all the way around. But because he had his adjutant below, any Australian trying to do a snap inspection, he would have been warned out straight away without heaps of time. It was the worst place to put that guy. Now, Italians. We all know stories of Italians in the community during the war. And it's kind of a secret and successful, a real successful story, is 1943, the Italians changed sides. Right, we know that during the Second World War. The Italians swapped sides in 1943. So all of a sudden we got thousands and thousands of Italian soldiers in captivity, wasting our money, and the government said, what are we going to do with these people? We can't let them free. How about we put them to work out on the farms, but we don't have to keep them in the camps anymore. So they offered them this deal, the prisoner of war control system it was called. They would offer their parole, and they would be put to work out throughout the communities of Victoria and southern New South Wales mainly, on farms. And they did great work out on farms. Now, the way it worked was an Australian officer and 7 other ranks, they formed this little unit, and they would be given a ute and a truck each, and then this little unit would be given control of up to 250 Italian prisoners of war. And basically it was their own little empire. That officer could control it however he wanted. So some officers decided to commandeer the local town hall, and they would have their prisoners work out on the local farms during the day, but they would have to sleep in the town hall at night, or the community hall at night, or whatever. They would have a cook there, cooking their meals, blah, blah, blah. Others said, I don't care, they can stay out on the farms. And they did. You know, I remember down in South Gippsland, many of the local Italian families that lived there had originally been there during the war, you know, working with dairy cattle. And the one thing they had to do was they had to be allowed access to the Roman Catholic Church on Sunday so they could worship, and so that the Australian officer or NCO could hear their complaints and fix any admin problems. And so it was incredibly successful. If they stuffed up, straight back behind the wire at Camp 13. So all these stories about, you know, Italian prisoners of war, you know, with the local women, and they're a bit of an urban myth. As soon as that was found out, bang, back behind the wire. It was strictly controlled. Now, remember I was saying about the Germans and Italians outside the Camp 13 complex with the fields of tomatoes and pyrethrum? Here's a tree, right? And it's right beside a road, near an irrigation ditch. And that paddock, between 1942 and 1947, was a field of tomatoes. Right? Irrigation laid on, great success story. Those tomatoes were picked, tended and picked by prisoners of war, loaded into crates, taken to the canneries in Melbourne, and, you know, put to work for the war effort. How do you stop a prisoner of war from nicking off if you got tomatoes this high? You hammer pegs into the tree, and you send a guard up there with a Martini cadet rifle, and he sits there for 2 hours, and he guards you looking down on him. And that tree is still there today, the guard tree. Yeah, just not far from Durranville. Now, this is all going swimmingly. In 1944 though, you'll notice I haven't talked about Japanese soldier prisoners of war. They weren't kept with the Germans and Italians in the early parts of the war. They were kept at camp number 17 in Cowra. Half Italians, half Japanese, camp number 17 in Cowra. Not many Japanese prisoners of war were actually taken, in comparison to Italians and Germans. So there was enough there for just half a camp, kept all our Japanese prisoners of war. In 1944, the Cowra Breakout happened. Some people call it a mass suicide. The Japanese, they were very ashamed of being captured, and so they planned to, they armed themselves over a series of weeks with baseball bats, wood, bits of steel that they'd scrounged up. They made weapons, knives, shivs. They started amassing blankets, and then during the middle of the night, the guard force knew something was going on. They were geeing each other, chanting. You could hear, ooh, there was a lot of unrest in the huts. Next thing, the huts were on fire, and the Japanese were racing towards the wire fence of the compound, throwing blankets over the wire and clambering over the top. The guard force opened fire, and it's the biggest single loss of life of any prisoner of war escape during the Second World War. 249 Japanese died that night. 2 George Crosses are awarded as a result of the Cowra Breakout. These 2 Australian soldiers had a machine gun, a Vickers machine gun in the back of a wagon, without a horse connected to it, just so they could get it up a bit higher, outside the wire. Japanese storm the fence, they get both sides of this wagon, and one Australian soldier is beating them off the wagon with a machine gun belt. The other guy manages to disable his Vickers machine gun, throw the bolt off into the night before they're overwhelmed and hacked to death. And they both received posthumously the George Cross. Why it wasn't the Victoria Cross, I've got no idea. But apparently that's not war. And whatever. Now, over the next week or so, those Japanese that weren't killed that night had to be rounded up. Most of them just sort of hung around the local area. Now, I was speaking to an old VDC guy. They eventually arrived at Murchison, at Camp 13. And he said to me, Tim, I reckon those Japanese guys got tortured. And I said, why is that? And he said, they had the living snot beaten out of them. And the real story is, the Australian Army that rounded them up were mostly made up of recruits from a nearby recruit training camp, and they hadn't done weapons training yet. And so they issued them with pick handles. And so you got these fanatical Japanese soldiers getting recaptured by scared Australian boys with pick handles. Now, if it comes down to you or them, or giving them a lathering with a pick handle, I know what I'm going to choose. And so most of the Japanese, they arrive at Murchison a week or 2 later, still with bad injuries, many broken limbs, lots of open wounds, covered in dust from the journey on open trucks under armed guard, and they're put into one of the compounds of Murchison. So you've got Italians and Germans in 2 compounds, and then half the camp is now full of these angry, belligerent Japanese soldiers. And it changes the whole mood in Camp 13 for the rest of the war. The guard force had heard what had happened to those Australian guards, and the new rule was no one goes into that compound with the Japanese unless there's there's more than one of you, and you're all armed with automatic weapons. You know, they gave them those Owen guns. And so, and even then there was a lot of unrest. You know, rocks would be chucked at the guards, you know, they'd try to beat you up. It was dangerous business in going into the Japanese compound. Now, the crew of the Kormoran used to be in that compound, or members of the crew of the Kormoran. And every year, they would hold their version of Remembrance Day. The Germans called it Heldentag, the Day of Heroes. And they would lay a wreath in front of a memorial and you know, say a few words. But now the Japanese were in there. So here's an example of a previous Heldentag ceremony that they were allowed to conduct there. You can see they were given their helmets and they made these, you know, wreaths, and it was very serious business for the Germans, their Heldentag ceremony. They would lay a wreath against their little memorial that they'd made there, and says, you can see there, Unsere gefallenen Kameraden, our fallen comrades. And that was built by the German Navy, the crew of the Kormoran there. Each year they would have that. Now the Japanese own that compound now, so the memorial's there. And the Germans go to the Australian guard, the commandant of the camp, and say, we want to still have our Heldentag commemorations. We want an escort in there so we can do our wreath laying. And the commandant said, are you kidding? No, it's not going to happen. But they were quite insistent, you know. You've led us before, you know, humanity, blah, blah, blah. We're honouring our fallen comrades. Will be no trouble, I promise. And so the commandant said, no worries, but only if you can get an escort of volunteers, because I'm not forcing anyone to do that. And so word went out, no one volunteered except one 19-year-old kid, an Australian boy. And the commandant said to him, you can do it, but you're not taking a weapon in there because you'll get overwhelmed and we'll have to open fire on you, on the people with a weapon. And so he went, yeah, all right, I'll do it. Now, I'll continue with that little bit of the story in a minute. Remember the wagon with the Vickers machine gun at Cowra getting overwhelmed? Our guard force in Murchison said, we want it much better. We want to have a bunker that we can lock ourselves in and let them try and overwhelm that, and we'll just shoot them all day. They can try and get in, we'll have a bunker. Now they tried to build a bunker, but it fell down. And in fact they tried twice and it fell down because, you know, they were just using river sand and, you know, it wasn't great. And so they said, how about we put the masters of concrete onto it? So the Italians built it, right? And it's still standing there today. You can see the Vickers machine gun tripod, and that overlooks the camp compound that the Japanese were in. And that was one of those additional security measures. Now, back to Heldentag. This 19-year-old kid, the commandant said, yep, you can go in, but you're laying the wreath. The Germans can stand along the fence, on their side of the fence. You're going in alone with a wreath. You can lay the wreath, and they can do whatever they need to do from their side of the compound. And this kid, I remember he was at the Cowra Museum and telling his story as an old man boy. And he said, I went in there and I was shitting myself. In short, he was shitting himself. And he said, I had this wreath and I just didn't want to look up. And all of a sudden I could hear hundreds and hundreds of footsteps behind me, walking behind me. And had the wreath, he's walking, I think it was about 40 metres, lays the wreath, does his thing, and then quickly makes his way to the little pedestrian gate, never wanting to look up the whole time. And quickly scoots through the gate, without breaking into a run, just one of those walks, right? And then he said, looked around behind me, and it was incredible. He said, lined up along that fence, you could see all the Germans standing to attention at the salute, and surrounding this memorial, these fanatical, belligerent Japanese soldiers also standing to attention, saluting the dead of an ally they didn't know, and leaving this 19-year-old kid to drop the wreath in and go. Incredible. So here we have this incredible story of humanity, I guess, and respect, right there in the bush in central Victoria. Incredible, isn't it? Something else that's incredible, it's still there. An enemy war memorial on Australian soil being left in peace. Oh, well, kind of left in peace. You can see during the war, it's got that the Ehrenkreuz on top, with the swastika and all that sort of Nazi rubbish. Well, after the war, the local farmers' kids used to have a ping at it with the 22s. But then the Germans, over the years, people that have been in the bag here during the war, they'd come back with their families in 1s and 2s. And eventually the De Niro boys. Now remember, the De Niro boys were mostly Jewish. They come back and they rebuild that memorial. Fix it up, make sure that Ehrenkreuz doesn't have a swastika on it anymore, and it's not silhouetted against the horizon there so that it's not a target for the local kids. But pretty much left alone, that war memorial. Incredible, isn't it? You can see it today. And there's the additional security measures in a paddock. Even the local farmer has stopped the cows from knocking it over by building that little wire fence. Pretty well overgrown now, you're not allowed in there. The farm's changed hands. The war dead of the Japanese war dead are in Cowra. It's been twinned with a Japanese city. It's now seen as a Japanese place of honour, the war cemetery there. There's, in fact, in Cowra, if you ever get the chance, there's the Japanese gardens, just beautiful. In Murchison is the Italian Ossario. That's where the war dead from both World Wars, from the Second World War, Italian war dead lay at rest in the ossuary there. The bones are gathered in their own little private vaults, and each name is there. It's like stepping back into Tuscany. They've got those pencil pine things and this beautiful Tuscan stonework. And every year on the 11th of November, the Italian community gathers there. And then in Tatura, just a few k's up the road, we've got the German war dead from both World Wars buried in the German War Cemetery. One of the few German war cemeteries maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Through a deal with the German government, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission looks after it in the most amazing condition, just beautiful. And that's where you find Obergef Heiter, Schurzental. So many remnants of this, so many themes that you can think, we don't make war on children, we treat people with humanity. If you're going to run an internment system and a prisoner of war system, I think accidentally the Australians got it right. And here's Camp 1 today, still just a paddock it's reverted back to being a paddock in central Victoria, just the way it should be. Hopefully war will never visit there again. Thanks for having me. I'll take some questions if I haven't bored you to death.
Got any questions for Tim? Anybody?
Yeah, I've got one. I tell you, not a question, but I had a Jewish Austrian partner, business partner, and he was given the tip off in Romania that the Jews are going to be got out of Romania by the Nazis. He finished up on a ship in Palestine, he went ashore, and then he heard that they were grabbing them all and putting them into jail. He said, I didn't understand any English. He said, I stood in front of this fellow, a very English-looking fellow. He said something in English, and the next thing he said, I was in a cell, but they were saying you were leaving tomorrow. He said, I was in a cell with a bloke called Moshi Dayan.
Oh,
He said, it turned out they sent me to Australia. And he said, I finished up in Cowra camp. And he said, we used to play cards with the guards. And he said, they were lovely people.
Yeah.
Then after the war, he went to work in the Hydro Commission.
Yeah, when you come face to face with people, it breaks down the barriers, right?
Yeah.
That so many of those Dunera Jews were initially taught in Palestine and then taken back to the UK and then put on the ship. Yeah, Palestine. Yeah, crazy, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware that the Dunera boys, they were actually, most of them were en route to America, and they were torpedoed, sent back to England, and then came out.
That's right.
And I mean, so many of them ended up being academic leaders and so on at Melbourne University.
Yeah, we were so lucky to get those people here, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was the Dunera boys, and I was mentioned to Peter Habsburger just before, because he's cardiologist for the Navy. Jerry Wagner was the cardiologist for the Army. I don't know if you've heard of him. His family were irrigation engineers, and they were in Palestine when war broke out. And they came from Württemberg in Germany, where Luther nailed the theses on the church door. But he was 14 when he came to Australia. He said it was the best thing, and they spent the rest of the war in Cowra. They all were educated, etc., because he ended up at Melbourne University doing a med degree after the war. Married a girl that he was with in Cowra with Elizabeth, was lovely. But, you know, that he said it was the best thing ever happened to him. He would never, if he hadn't had that sort of incarceration of a sort, ever succeed.
Think about what they would have gone back to as well.
Oh God. Yeah.
You know, like in fact, I should tell that story a little bit. Is the Australians said, you know, if you're a belligerent, i.e. German Army or German Navy or German Air Force, you are going back to Germany. They're not giving you the option of staying here, right? So there was one fella, Gefreiter Pexer. He was known as the master escaper. Now, he would nick off and be recaptured so many times they were getting sick of him, right? So they put him in front, you know, he's in the can for 28 days in the solitary confinement. He'd get out and then off he'd go again, right? And they put him in front of Ruthven BC. And at the end of the war, Ruthven said, I'm putting you in the can again, 28 days, because you've just done it again. You got to promise me you're not going to do it again, because the ship's coming and you're going back home. And Pexer goes, yeah, no drama. And then he heard through the guard force that the ship had arrived. Off he goes again. And they got him, I think it was 949, 952, something like that, when he was finally captured. And he was hiding in plain sight. I think he was the president of the German club, the Tivoli Club. Like, eventually went home, but then straight back here, you know? Yeah, and it's sort of testament to, you know, just how good it was for him, you know?
I heard a story some years back. I don't know how accurate it is, but they said Captain Donuts from Kormoran and all the other people that were captured and been in prisoner of war camps in that area, they didn't send them home until 1948, 3 years after the war had finished. And they brought them down to Station Pier to join a ship to sail to Germany, and berthed across right opposite them in Princess Pier was a Dutch ship of the same name exactly that they pretended to be when they were flying the Dutch ensign and ready to suck in.
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, 1947, 1948, the Germans started going home, and the last of them, because remember there's a worldwide shipping crisis because the Germans had put a lot of them on the bottom of the ocean. Many of them didn't get home for a long time.
So that could be true.
Yeah, it could well be true. Yeah, I believe it. Yes, sir.
Can I just tell a story from the other side? One of my patients was shot down, a German, was shot down over Arnhem in 1944. and he became a POW in England. And at the end of the war, they were put to work on Aldershot, painting concrete, those sort of things you occupy. And in 1947, the British officer, the major who was in charge of the POWs, got married. And he invited this chap to his wedding. So he applied through the Red Cross for his Luftwaffe dress uniform. And the Red Cross sent it over to him. So he went to the wedding in his Luftwaffe dress uniform, and he said the only thing that he wasn't allowed to wear was the little dagger that they had in their belt. Anyway, he said, I was a wow at the party. And he said, they were General and Mr. So and such and such and such. He said, order, officer. Well, he came to Australia, but in 1997, he was invited back to the Major's 50th wedding anniversary, and he went back to Silesia, went back to where he was shot down, and then returned to Australia. I might add, he didn't get back to Germany from England until December 1949. And he came back after the wedding and died shortly thereafter.
The German POWs that got caught in Denmark, they got told none of you are going home until the last mine's cleared. And many of them died on the beaches of Denmark. Yeah,
Because they send a lot of kids out to do it.
absolutely. Yeah, some of them got dragged over from Germany after the war. None of you are going home until the last mine is gone. Yeah.
Have you got a record of how many prisoners of war we actually had in Australia?
Yeah, I was just looking at it before. Sorry, the number eludes me, but particularly the Germans, they're very well documented. The Italians, there was loads more Italians, Other nations, we even in Camp 13, there was a couple of Finnish people, like different times of the war, they were either on the German side or not. Either way, you're going beyond the war. Romanians, there's some Romanians. There's one guy buried in the German war cemetery at Tachura, and he's got no rank, no nothing. He's just got the name Muhammad. Now there's a story there, I can't get to the bottom of it. He's just called Muhammad. I think he must have been a stoker on a German ship or something. I don't know. Yes, I do.
I knew a Dunera boy called Bert Barber, and he went through Melbourne University in the late 40s and did a degree in electrical engineering. Anyway, he told me, or his wife told me, that they had this reunion at Hay that you were talking about. And when they arrived in 1942, there was a dust storm. And when they went back in the visit in 1990, when they arrived, there was another dust storm.
There's that saying, hey, Helen Booligal, right? Yeah. That's why they moved him out there. It's a toilet. Yeah.
Maybe the annual aid. Ken?
Yeah, it's interesting in the 1950s where The Great Escape, the film, the book, where you had the Allies breaking out of a German camp. The opposite was here in Victoria, where the Germans were tunnelling out of an Allied camp.
I found that just through research over the years, the amount of times where you read about Allied prisoners of war doing this thing over in Europe, and the Germans, in complete isolation from them, coming up with the same solution to the same problem in our camps. Like the radio in the roof, and all this stuff. Ingenious people, when they get desperate, they get clever, don't they?
And it was in the book Research for the Sydney, they said that Deckner's had cancer and he was treated in the repack at Heidelberg before he went
I've heard
back.
that, yeah.
And there was a raid on a castle in Germany after the Sydney, led by Ian Fleming, who was Naval Intelligence. He led a special forces raid on this castle in Germany to get the coordinates of what happened with the Sydney. story,
Mm.
and it turns out all the coordinates were accurate that the Germans gave.
Yeah, he told the truth.
Yeah.
Him and his crew
Everything
told the
was
truth.
correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
You got a question?
Do you know if many of the Italian POWs settled in the Dandenongs after the war? Because my grandfather had a small mixed farm at Cockatoo, and I was also under the impression that many of the Italians who set up farms in the Dandenongs post World War II were migrants. I'm just wondering if some
But
of the ex-POWs.
I can guarantee you that some of them would have been. Like, if you look at the Australian tobacco industry, for better or worse, was founded by Italians in the town of Myrtleford, right? You don't have to be a brain surgeon to work that out. But up in the Dandenongs, it's orchards right after the war. They're natural orchardists,
Right.
right?
Many of them had potato farms.
Yeah.
in the Dandenongs.
Yeah.
That's what my grandfather once
Yeah.
said.
You know, the Gippsland dairy farms, you know, like those family names, the Dippolettos and blah, blah, they're still down there. And I know Mr Dippoletto came out here as a prisoner of war.
You used the term humanity a number of times in there.
Yeah.
It reminded me of that term of man's humanity to man. But you touched on the other aspect of that, and indeed the humanity that can be applied to amongst combat foes, indeed. I think that was a fascinating story, and I'm glad. I'd also like to thank Janet, who said it's nice and refreshing to see have a presentation that's not about old men and old ships. With all due respect to the old men here. And the fact is that was a fascinating story. I believe, told from the heart. You've invested a lot of your time and energy and knowledge and study into this topic, and know it obviously pretty well by heart. But thank you for sharing it with us. I think everybody would agree. It's a fascinating story. I'm sure there were lots and lots more bits to it. But from our point of view, I think we all really appreciate it very much hearing what happened here in Victoria mostly. So on behalf of all of us, could I think we give you a round of applause. You mentioned Italian tobacco growers further north, because I thought you might appreciate something that is loosely descended from Italian tobacco growers, i.e. the ones that became winemakers up in the King Valley, and something to take home. Thanks very much.